I really want to thank Dr. Weida because I think that economics is such an important part of the argument and is often ignored. We really need to see how these operations are making use of tax dollars and if they're sustainable or they are not. Thank you, Dr. Weida.
Well, thank you, Maria. I'm going to pull this thing out of here. There we go. I was a professor for such a long period of time that I simply can't stand behind a podium and do anything except duck when people are shooting. So I had an unusual experience when I was driving down to the airport. We live about 100 miles north of the closest airport, and so I was coming out here on Thursday and listening to NPR, and there was a woman on there who was talking about a group of food issues, and she started out talking about industrially raised food, and she said, and this was the quote, and we all know how bad that is, and then just moved right on with the next part of the program. That's a major deal for me, because when I got started in this years and years ago, nobody knew how bad it was, and now it's kind of a generally recognized thing. What I'd like to do with you today is to share some thoughts about the way this movement is going. And I think it's going to affect you in the future, just as it's affecting us. There are some big changes afoot here. You know, my family at one point in time was from around Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And in fact, we still, I think, have some random Weidas hanging around up there. Most that weren't shot or hung headed west. And we wound up out in Idaho eventually. And one of my most recent contacts with Pennsylvania was 20 or more years ago with an export of yours, which was 3 Mile Island. Oh. 3 Mile Island, you may or may not know, wound up in my backyard outside of Idaho Falls, Idaho. And when someone questioned the large group of idiots who was moving this out there, the question was, why us? And the response was, well, this is a rural area. There's no people out there, which was news to those of us who were living there. But it also has to do with our current way that we kind of take a look at pollution and what we do with our waste here in the United States. And so I'd like to start with that. A number of years ago, 1992 to be exact, there was a guy by the name of Larry Ecohawk who was an individual who aspired to be a representative from the state of Idaho, and he was a Democrat, which meant that his chances were slim and none. And he had the fortune, good fortune, to be not elected at the time that Bill Clinton was elected, which meant that since there was a Democratic administration, a job would be found for him since he was not elected. And Larry's job, since he was a Native American, was that they named him the National Waste Negotiator. Now, what waste was he negotiating? It was nuke waste. And who was he negotiating with? The Indian reservations. Why? Well, there weren't any people out there. There were also a whole group of strange governments, and they were also offering them $2 million a whack to study whether or not they should accept the waste. This was a very subtle intelligence test. Every reservation who could figure it out took the deal and said, we'll spend $2 million trying to figure out whether we're not going to take this, which, by the way, we're not. A couple, one notably in Utah, said, oh, we'll take it. But the idea here was that just as with 3 Mile Island, the rural areas were being designated as the receptacles for the waste. Now, if you look at this type of pollution that we get from this, I have coined a new term. which is going to drive the people at Johns Hopkins absolutely nuts, which, by the way, is part of my job description. And that is, I call it community impairing pollution. And what I mean by that is pollution which occurs close enough to people to have a direct and immediate health effect. As opposed to something like, for example, acid rain, which we all know what the problems were, and we remember all the early movies which were done of what the effects of acid rain were. But it was coming from way over there, and it was going way over here, and it wasn't like somebody stoked up a coal furnace over here and somebody died the next day here. Now the leaves were falling off the maple trees. That's different than having pollution which has the types of effects that we've been talking about with gas fracking here. Now, community impairing pollution really got its big start with the Industrial Revolution, which got its big start right after the Enclosure Act in Great Britain in the 1600s, which caused a whole raft of people to move into the cities where they became available as cheap labor and found themselves living in, number one, unhealthy conditions, and number two, in an increasingly deadly atmosphere where the average homeowner or home resident family in London was burning a ton, a ton a month of coal. And London was big enough that the visibility was so poor that street lights had to be left on during the day and everybody was having these terrible problems. The answer to that wasn't necessarily to clean things up. It was just to move the pollution someplace where you could have more of it. And so the Industrial Revolution, after a couple of people cleverly, if you recall, stole a design for the looms, moved to the United States, where we had just as bad a pollution in various communities. And quite frankly, that rather deplorable situation lasted until the Second World War. And right up through the war, it was justified under the fact that we needed it because we were fighting the war. But after the war, because community organization had improved, because unions were stronger, because of the visibility of the pollution, there were a whole group of acts which were taken to try and protect things. Remember when the river caught on fire in Cincinnati and all those types of great occurrences in American history? Well, those acts caused kind of a revision in terms of how we did things. And after that, we kind of decided we wouldn't stop polluting, we'd just move it. And where we moved it to was basically to rural areas. And this happened because rural areas were becoming the center of poverty in the United States too. And poverty was moving out of the urban areas, away from those programs, and into a rural setting. Now, as it moved to rural areas, it benefited because there you could pollute, and the visibility of the pollution was lower because there weren't as many people. The laws were looser because nobody ever thought that you'd have to have laws for industrial pollution in rural areas. And the politics was a heck of a lot better. Lots of people out there living in those rural areas and cleaning their guns at night, listen to Rush Limbaugh all day, and by the end of the winter, at least in Idaho, they're ready to shoot somebody just for the hell of it. These folks are running for county commissioner, and it was a pretty easy place to get polluting activities moved in. Now, right after the Second World War, economics as a discipline began to talk about a specific concept, which was called internalization of costs. Now, what that means in plain language, and as an economist, we try and keep from using plain language to keep the riffraff out of the sport. You know, if everybody understood economics, then we wouldn't make the big bucks we make as economists. What internalization of costs means is that if you create a cost yourself, you're supposed to wrap that into your area of production or whatever else it is that you're engaged in, and you're supposed to pay that cost out of what you get for the goods. So, if you are, for example, a state like Pennsylvania, and you incurred a cost like 3 Mile Island providing power, you don't break up the plant and send it to Idaho. You break up the plant and mail a part of it to everybody who lit their house with the electricity from that plant. An interesting concept, particularly if you're from Idaho. Unlikely to occur. And internalization of costs is difficult to apply. But at any rate, if you don't do this, what happens is that since we judge all activities in the United States with a cost-benefit analysis, if you don't internalize your costs, they're too low. And if you get the benefits back from drilling for shale, for example, and if the costs are listed too low, the profit is too high. And if you are a free market economist, you're going to choose what you're going to do by where you can make the most profit. And guess where that is? That's where the costs are not internalized. And so we sit now in rural areas with things like shale drilling and with things like CAFOs, where in both cases, the people who are engaged in doing it are absolute experts in not recording the costs. That's what they're best at. They're second best at other things, but they really are best at not recording the costs. Now, in addition, when you move to a rural area, you get an entirely different dynamic than you get in urban areas. In urban areas, when you pollute, there's a whole group of people right around it who tend to die, and it's really noticeable. In rural areas, when you pollute, you can kind of pick them off one by one, and it's not nearly as noticeable. Secondly, we have this rural code. I was raised under the rural code. A number of you were too. One way to state it is that you avoid creating costs that adversely affect your neighbor, even if you don't like your neighbor, because you live in an area where you need to help each other survive, and that's absolutely essential for you to build a community. That's basically the rural code. I tend to say that people from rural areas suffer from terminal politeness. A neighbor moves in and says, well, I want to set up, as happened in Idaho, a 50,000 sow farrow to finish operation for hogs. Going to be a throughput of 1 million hogs a year. Going to have a bunch of waste lagoons. And they're going to be, you remember Kathy? Kathy, it was the first time I ever worked with Kathy. A bunch of waste lagoons. Turns out the amount of waste generated was the same, well, actually it exceeded the amount that was generated by the entire state of Idaho. That was pretty interesting, since it was on 800 acres. And what were they going to do with this stuff? Nothing. They were going to let the lagoons evaporate, lock the gates, and leave. We actually turned that down. That was kind of a seminal event in Idaho. Idaho never turns down polluting activities, but we did turn that down. So, what happened though during that time is even talking to the neighbors then, the deal was, well, you know, it's their land, they really want to do this and that, and I remember a guy in Canada, one time we were up there working, and he had the saying, which was, well, good for you, bad for me. Okay. Does that mean then that you let them go ahead and do, well, yeah, you know, it's, well, okay, so you get the idea. So what happens is, with the rural code is, that neighbors really have a predisposition to just keep quiet and not speak up. That's really what it is. And that's not good, because one of the things that happens in rural areas that does not happen in urban areas is that there's a very disparate impact from pollution. In urban areas, if you want to set up a center of pollution in a town, what's going to happen is a whole bunch of people are going to be affected. In rural areas, what happens is that very few people are affected, but they are tremendously adversely affected. So, as you say, you can't sell your house. If you have a house around a CAFO or someplace where you can smell a CAFO, you are tremendously